Imagine being a young girl, proud of your identity, only to have it stripped away in the cruelest way. What happens next will leave you speechless. If this story inspired you, like the video and share it. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make a difference. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of East Haven Middle School, illuminating the polished floors and neatly arranged rows of lockers. Nia adjusted her backpack, her fingers brushing against the carefully styled curls of her afro. She smiled to herself. Her mother had spent hours last night perfecting the style, twisting each curl with care and filling the house with the faint scent of coconut oil and lavender. It was a small ritual of love, a quiet affirmation of their culture and pride. Nia's confidence carried her through the hallway, where the voices of her classmates swirled around her. She wasn't naive. She had heard the whispers before. Why doesn't she straighten it? It's so big, like a bush. But today, she refused to let the comments bother her. Her poetry notebook was tucked safely in her bag, and she had been looking forward to sharing her latest work in English class, a poem about finding beauty in chaos. Her optimism faltered when she entered Mrs. Whitewood's classroom. The woman stood by the whiteboard, her arms crossed and her mouth pressed into a thin line. Mrs. Whitewood was known for her no-nonsense demeanor and an almost militant obsession with rules. Nia had always been wary of her, sensing an undercurrent of disapproval whenever they interacted. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Whitewood said in her clipped tone, scanning the room like a hawk. Her gaze lingered on Nia, narrowing slightly before she turned back to the board. "Today, we'll begin with silent reading. Take out your books." Nia slid into her seat, avoiding Mrs. Whitewood's gaze. She reached into her bag, pulling out her poetry notebook instead of the assigned textbook. The words she had written the night before seemed to leap off the page, eager to be heard. But just as she began to read quietly to herself, the classroom door creaked open. 3 girls slipped in, giggling softly. They were late, as usual, but Mrs. Whitewood didn't seem to notice, or perhaps, Nia thought bitterly, she chose not to notice. These were the same girls who often whispered cruel jokes about her hair, making sure she could hear them. They slid into their seats behind Nia, and within moments, she felt a crumpled piece of paper hit her back. Ignoring it, Nia focused on her notebook. Her heart sank when she heard the whispering behind her. "Is it getting bigger, or is it just me? It's like a bird's nest. I bet something's living in there." Nia clenched her jaw, willing herself not to react. She knew better than to give them the satisfaction, but their laughter was sharp, cutting through her resolve. Before she could turn around, Mrs. Whitewood's voice rang out. "Miss Carter." The emphasis on her last name was deliberate, and it sent a chill down Nia's spine. "Is there a reason you're not following the assigned reading?" I was just..." Nia hesitated, holding up her notebook. "I was reading something I wrote. I thought." "That's your first mistake," Mrs. Whitewood interrupted, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "The assignment was to read the material I provided, not to indulge in your personal hobbies." A ripple of laughter spread across the room. Nia's face burned with embarrassment, but she swallowed her pride and nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She slid her notebook back into her bag and reached for the textbook. As she flipped through the pages, she felt the bullies behind her leaning in, their whispers growing bolder. "Did you see how she just sat there? She thinks she's so special with that hair. She's probably hiding in it. Too bad we can still see her face." Nia's hands trembled as she gripped her book. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but every time she tried, her voice caught in her throat. The weight of Mrs. Whitewood's disapproval hung over her like a storm cloud. The class dragged on, with Mrs. Whitewood's sharp comments slicing through the air. When the bell finally rang, Nia gathered her things as quickly as she could, hoping to escape the classroom before anyone else could say something cruel. But as she reached the door, Mrs. Whitewood's voice stopped her. "Miss Carter, a word." Nia froze, turning slowly to face her teacher. The other students filed out, shooting her smug or sympathetic glances. Mrs. Whitewood waited until the room was empty before speaking. "You need to learn that individuality has its place," she said, her tone measured but icy. "But in this classroom, conformity is what matters. That hair of yours is a distraction, not just to you, but to everyone else. I suggest you consider what message you're sending with it." Nia stared at her, stunned into silence. The words felt like a slap, each one laced with unspoken judgment. She wanted to scream, to demand why her hair was any different from the blonde ponytails or straight bobs of her classmates. But instead, She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes, ma'am. As she left the room, her confidence shattered. Nia couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Something about Mrs. Whitewood's tone, the smugness in her eyes, told her that the teacher had plans for her, plans that Nia wouldn't like. The following day began like any other, but for Nia, the weight of Mrs. Whitewood's words lingered. She woke up early, staring at herself in the mirror longer than usual. Her hair, which had always been a source of pride, now felt like a target. Her mother's encouraging words from the night before, "Don't let anyone dim your light, sweetheart," echoed in her mind. But as she adjusted her headband, she wondered if she had the strength to keep shining. At school, the whispers began before she even reached her locker. She still thinks that hair is cute. Didn't the teacher talk to her yesterday? Guess she doesn't listen. Nia ignored the comments, focusing on her poetry notebook tucked safely in her bag. Today was supposed to be an art day, a reprieve from the monotony of lectures and worksheets. But as she entered the classroom, the air felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't quite place. Mrs. Whitewood stood by the teacher's desk, her arms crossed and her sharp eyes scanning the students as they filed in. When her gaze landed on Nia, it lingered, a subtle smirk playing on her lips. Nia's stomach twisted, but she took her seat without a word. "Good morning, class," Mrs. Whitewood began, her voice smooth but with an edge. "Before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone of the importance of maintaining a professional appearance. This is, after all, a place of learning, not a fashion show." Nia felt the words like a physical blow. She kept her head down, pretending to organize her supplies, but the giggles from behind her were impossible to ignore. The lesson progressed uneventfully until the art project began. Each student was tasked with creating a self-portrait using mixed media, paper, markers, and various textures provided at their tables. Nia's love for art was second only to her passion for poetry, and she quickly lost herself in the activity. Her portrait wasn't just a reflection of her features, it was an explosion of color and texture, a celebration of her identity. As she added the finishing touches to her depiction of her curly hair, she felt a shadow fall over her. Looking up, she saw Mrs. Whitewood standing by her desk, her lips pressed into a thin line. "What is this supposed to be?" the teacher asked, holding up the portrait for the class to see. Nia's chest tightened. It's me," she said softly. Mrs. Whitewood's brow furrowed, and she tilted the paper as if trying to decipher a foreign language. "I see," she said finally, her voice dripping with condescension. "It's certainly bold, but don't you think it might be a little exaggerated? Art should reflect reality, Miss Carter, not whatever fantasy you've concocted." The class erupted in laughter. Nia felt her face burn, but she held back the tears threatening to spill. She wanted to say something, to stand up for herself, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she turned her attention back to her desk, her hands trembling as she gripped her pencil. "That's enough," Mrs. Whitewood said, silencing the class. She leaned closer to Nia, lowering her voice so only she could hear. "If you can't take constructive criticism, perhaps you should rethink your approach, both in art and in life." The rest of the class passed in a blur. When the bell rang, Nia bolted from the room, clutching her portrait to her chest. She barely noticed the curious stares or the whispered taunts as she made her way to the restroom. Locking herself in a stall, she finally let the tears fall, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. As Nia composed herself, wiping her face with a tissue, she didn't notice the time slipping away. By the time she returned to the classroom to retrieve her bag, most of the students had already left for lunch. Only Mrs. Whitewood remained, sorting through papers at her desk. "You're late," the teacher said without looking up. "Again, I just needed a minute," Nia replied, her voice steadier than she expected. Mrs. Whitewood finally looked up, her expression unreadable. "You've been disruptive all week, Miss Carter. This behavior won't be tolerated." "I haven't done anything wrong," Nia said, her frustration bubbling to the surface. You just refuse to listen," Mrs. Whitewood snapped, standing up and walking toward her. "That hair, that attitude, it's all a distraction. And if you won't do something about it, I will." Before Nia could process what was happening, Mrs. Whitewood grabbed her by the arm and led her toward the staff lounge. Panic rose in Nia's chest. "Wait, what are you doing?" "We're going to fix this," Mrs. Whitewood said sharply. "Right now." The small room was sterile and cold, filled with filing cabinets and a table stacked with supplies. Mrs. Whitewood rummaged through a drawer before pulling out a pair of scissors. Nia's heart raced as she realized what was about to happen. "No," she said, backing away. "You can't. This isn't up for debate," Mrs. Whitewood said, her voice cold and unyielding. "You've been given plenty of chances to conform, and now I'm taking matters into my own hands." Before Nia could stop her, the teacher grabbed a handful of her hair and began cutting. Each snip felt like a dagger, not just to her scalp, but to her very sense of self. Tears streamed down her face as she stood frozen, too shocked and terrified to move. When it was over, Mrs. Whitewood stepped back, holding the severed curls in her hand like a trophy. "There," she said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "Much better. Now you look like a proper student." Nia stared at her reflection in the small mirror on the wall. Her hair, her crown, was gone, replaced by jagged tufts that only emphasized her humiliation. She couldn't hold back the sob that escaped her lips. "Go back to class," Mrs. Whitewood said dismissively, turning her attention back to her papers. "And wipe those tears. You'll thank me someday." Nia stumbled out of the room, clutching her bag and what little remained of her dignity. She didn't know how, but she vowed in that moment that Mrs. Whitewood would pay for what she had done. The moment Nia stepped out of the staff lounge, the walls seemed to close in on her. She kept her head down, avoiding the stares of students passing in the hallway. Her heart pounded, each beat resonating with the anguish and humiliation she felt. She couldn't bring herself to face anyone, not even the friends who called her name, their voices tinged with concern. Nia's legs carried her automatically toward the one place that had always felt safe, the art room. Mr. Bennett, the art teacher, was arranging supplies when she burst through the door, her breath hitching with suppressed sobs. "Nia?" Mr. Bennett looked up, alarmed. "What happened?" Unable to speak, Nia shook her head and collapsed into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook as the weight of the morning finally broke her. Mr. Bennett approached cautiously, kneeling beside her. "Take your time," he said gently. "I'm here when you're ready." After several minutes, Nia finally looked up, her eyes swollen and red. She hesitated, then lifted her hand to touch her uneven hair. The act of speaking the words aloud felt impossible, but her reflection in the window spoke volumes. Who did this to you?" Mr. Bennett asked, his voice low but laced with concern. "Mrs. Whitewood," Nia whispered, her voice trembling. She said my hair was a distraction. She cut it." Mr. Bennett's face darkened. He stood abruptly, pacing the room as he processed what he had just heard. That's completely unacceptable," he said, his voice rising slightly before he caught himself. "She had no right." Nia nodded numbly, clutching the fabric of her skirt. "She said I'd thank her for it." A long silence stretched between them before Mr. Bennett spoke again. "Nia, this isn't something you should have to carry alone. Have you told anyone else? Your parents?" The mention of her father sent a wave of emotion crashing over her. She hadn't even thought about how he would react or how she would tell him. Nia shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I can't," she said. "What if he's mad? What if I get in more trouble?" Mr. Bennett knelt again, meeting her gaze. "You're not the one in trouble, Nia. What Mrs. Whitewood did was wrong, plain and simple, and someone needs to hold her accountable." By the time the final bell rang, Nia had made up her mind. With Mr. Bennett's encouragement echoing in her ears, she walked to the front office. The secretary greeted her warmly, as always, but Nia barely noticed. She pushed open the door to the principal's office, her hands shaking. Her father, Mr. Carter, looked up from his desk, his usual calm demeanor instantly shifting to concern when he saw her face. "Nia? What's wrong?" For a moment, Nia stood frozen. The words felt too heavy, too complicated to explain. But then the tears came again, and she blurted it all out. The bullying, the comments, and finally, Mrs. Whitewood's scissors slicing through her hair. As she spoke, her father's expression hardened, his jaw tightening with each word. He leaned forward, his hands clasped together on the desk. When she finished, silence filled the room. She did what?" he asked, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that sent a shiver down Nia's spine. Nia nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "She said I needed to conform." Mr. Carter stood abruptly, pacing the room. His usual composed demeanor was replaced by a barely restrained fury. "Nia, I need you to know something," he said, turning to face her. "This is not your fault. Do you understand me? What she did was not only wrong, it was inexcusable." Nia looked up, her lip trembling. Are you? Are you going to do something? Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression softening. I'm going to handle this. But I need you to trust me, okay? She nodded, relief mingling with apprehension. For the first time that day, she felt a glimmer of hope. The next morning, Nia waited anxiously in her father's office while he called a staff meeting. She could hear the murmurs of teachers gathering in the conference room down the hall, their voices rising in curiosity. When Mrs. Whitewood walked into the room, she didn't notice Nia, sitting just out of sight. Principal Carter wasted no time. He stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding attention. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone even but firm. "I've called this meeting to address a serious incident that occurred yesterday." Mrs. Whitewood's smug expression faltered. "What kind of incident?" "I think you know," he replied, fixing her with a sharp gaze. "A teacher took it upon themselves to humiliate and physically alter a student in a way that is not only unethical, but entirely against school policy. Nia, would you step in here, please?" The room fell silent as Nia entered, her uneven hair stark against the backdrop of the neatly dressed adults. Gasps rippled through the group, and Mrs. Whitewood's face turned a shade paler. "This," Principal Carter continued, gesturing toward his daughter, "is my daughter, Nia. And yesterday, Mrs. Whitewood decided that her natural hair was a distraction, so much so that she physically cut it without her consent." The room erupted in murmurs. Some teachers looked horrified. Others glanced nervously at Mrs. Whitewood, who sat frozen, her expression a mix of shock and defiance. "I did what I thought was best," she stammered, attempting to regain her composure. "Her hair was—" "Stop," Principal Carter said, his voice cutting through her excuse like a knife. "There is no justification for what you did. None. Your actions were not only unprofessional, but deeply harmful." Mrs. Whitewood opened her mouth to respond, but the weight of the room's judgment silenced her. Principal Carter continued, outlining the immediate consequences. Her suspension pending a full investigation, mandatory training for all staff, and a public apology to Nia. As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Whitewood left the room in disgrace, the weight of her actions hanging heavy around her. Principal Carter turned to Nia, who stood at the back of the room. He opened his arms, and she rushed into them, feeling at last the safety she had been searching for. The day after the staff meeting, the atmosphere at East Haven Middle School shifted. The news of Mrs. Whitewood's actions had spread among the staff and students, but Principal Carter ensured that the focus remained on accountability, not gossip. Nia, though still fragile, walked the halls with her head held a little higher, bolstered by the knowledge that justice was finally being served. But the story wasn't over, not yet. In the days following the incident, Nia found herself avoiding mirrors. Every time she caught a glimpse of her uneven hair, a pang of hurt and humiliation shot through her chest. The curls she and her mother had so lovingly nurtured were gone, stolen by Mrs. Whitewood's cruel hands. But what hurt more than the physical loss was the memory of her teacher's smug expression, as if she had done Nia a favor. One evening, Nia sat at the kitchen table, her poetry notebook open but untouched. Her father joined her, setting down a cup of chamomile tea. "You don't have to pretend to be okay," he said gently, breaking the silence. Nia shrugged, her fingers tracing the edge of the notebook. I don't know how to feel. Angry, sad, embarrassed. It's all mixed up." Mr. Carter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "What happened to you was wrong on so many levels, and you have every right to feel those things. But don't let it define you, Nia. You're so much more than what she tried to take from you." Nia looked up at him, her eyes glassy. How? How do I move past it?" "By remembering who you are," he said, his voice steady. "Your hair is a part of you, but it doesn't define your worth. You do that. And if you ever need a reminder, just look around at the people who love and support you." Nia's gaze dropped to the notebook. Slowly, she picked up her pen and began to write. The words didn't come easily at first, but as she poured her emotions onto the page, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitewood's suspension triggered a deeper investigation into her conduct. As the administration reviewed her files, more complaints surfaced, subtle but damning evidence of her bias. Several parents came forward, sharing stories of their children being unfairly punished or singled out in class. One mother, whose son had transferred to another school, described how Mrs. Whitewood had repeatedly shamed him for his dyslexia, calling him lazy in front of his peers. Another parent revealed that their daughter, a Latina student, had been sent to detention for speaking Spanish during lunch. The picture painted by these accounts was clear. Mrs. Whitewood's behavior was part of a troubling pattern, not an isolated incident. The school board convened to discuss her fate, and though she tried to defend herself, claiming her actions were misunderstood, her excuses fell flat. Eventually, Mrs. Whitewood was forced to resign. The once respected teacher left the school in disgrace, her reputation in tatters. With Mrs. Whitewood gone, the school's environment began to change. Principal Carter spearheaded a series of initiatives aimed at fostering inclusivity and understanding among students and staff. Diversity workshops, cultural appreciation events, and revised disciplinary policies became cornerstones of the school's transformation. For Nia, the changes were a small but significant step toward healing. She began wearing a series of colorful headscarves to school, each one a bold statement of resilience. Her peers noticed, and some even complimented her on her style. "You look amazing, Nia," said one girl, a shy smile on her face. "I wish I had your confidence." Nia smiled back, feeling a flicker of pride. "Thanks. It's not always easy, but I'm learning." One day during art class, Mr. Bennett approached her with a quiet suggestion. "Nia, I've been thinking, how would you feel about sharing one of your poems at the school's upcoming assembly? I think your voice is exactly what people need to hear right now." At first, Nia hesitated. The idea of standing in front of the entire school made her stomach churn. But as she thought about everything she had endured, a sense of determination took hold. This was her chance to reclaim her narrative, to show everyone, including herself, that she was stronger than the pain she had suffered. The gymnasium was packed on the day of the assembly, the buzz of students' voices filling the air. Nia stood backstage, clutching her notebook. Her father had offered to introduce her, but she insisted on walking out alone. This was her moment, and she wanted to own it. When her name was called, the crowd fell silent. Nia stepped onto the stage, her head held high. She wore a bright yellow scarf that her mother had helped her tie that morning, and for the first time in weeks, she felt beautiful. Taking a deep breath, she began to read. "My hair is not a distraction. It is history woven into strands, a story that cannot be erased by scissors or sharp tongues. My hair is my pride, my roots reaching deep, holding me steady when the winds try to break me. You can cut it, but you will never cut me." Her voice grew stronger with each line, resonating through the gym like a song. When she finished, the applause was deafening. Students and teachers rose to their feet, clapping and cheering. Nia looked out into the crowd and saw her father standing in the front row, tears in his eyes and a smile on his face. As Nia stepped off the stage, she felt a sense of closure. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could move forward, stronger and more determined than ever. In the weeks that followed, life at East Haven continued, but the lessons from Nia's experience lingered. Teachers became more mindful of their words and actions, and students began to speak up when they saw injustice. The school, once a place of hidden biases, became a beacon of change. And for Nia, each day was a step toward reclaiming not just her hair, but her voice, her pride, and her sense of self. The morning after the assembly, Nia woke up to the sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of peace. Her yellow scarf, still folded neatly on her desk, was a reminder of the victory she had claimed, not just over Mrs. Whitewood, but over her own fears. As she got ready for school, her mother peeked into the room. "You were incredible yesterday," she said, a proud smile on her face. Nia turned, smiling shyly. "I was nervous. And you still did it," her mother said, pulling her into a hug. "Your voice is powerful, Nia. Don't ever let anyone silence it." When Nia arrived at East Haven, she noticed an immediate shift. Teachers greeted her warmly, their smiles genuine, and her classmates looked at her with newfound respect. The bullies who once mocked her were conspicuously quiet, their laughter replaced with awkward glances. During English class, Nia caught one of them, a girl named Chelsea, staring at her. When Nia met her gaze, Chelsea quickly looked away, her face flushed. As the class ended, Chelsea approached her hesitantly. "Hey, Nia," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I wanted to say I'm sorry for the things I said about your hair. They were mean and wrong." Nia studied her for a moment, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "Thanks," she said finally. "That means a lot." Chelsea nodded, her shoulders relaxing. "You're really brave, you know. I could never do what you did yesterday." Nia offered a small smile. "I didn't think I could either, But I guess you never know how strong you are until you have to be. The two girls parted ways, but the conversation left Nia feeling lighter. She realized that change, no matter how small, was beginning to take root. Later that day, Nia stopped by the art room to thank Mr. Bennett for encouraging her to perform at the assembly. He greeted her with his usual warm smile and gestured for her to sit. "You've inspired a lot of people, Nia," he said, leaning against his desk, "including me. You know, I've been thinking about starting a student-led initiative, something focused on self-expression and celebrating diversity. And I can't think of anyone better to help lead it than you." Nia's eyes widened. "Me? But I don't know how to." "You don't have to know everything right away," Mr. Bennett said. "All you need is the courage to start. The rest will come." Nia hesitated, but then she remembered the applause at the assembly, the way her words had resonated with the crowd. "Okay," she said, a spark of excitement in her voice. "I'll do it." Over the next few weeks, Nia and Mr. Bennett worked together to create the school's first annual celebration of diversity. The event featured student art, performances, and presentations highlighting the beauty of different cultures and identities. Nia wrote and performed another poem for the occasion, this one celebrating unity and resilience. The event was a resounding success. Students who had once felt invisible found their voices, and even those who had stayed silent in the face of injustice began to speak up. East Haven Middle School, once marred by unspoken prejudices, began to transform into a community of understanding and mutual respect. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitewood's life had taken a sharp turn. Unable to find work in the local school district, she spent her days reflecting on the choices that had led to her downfall. At first, she was filled with resentment, blaming Nia and Principal Carter for her misfortune. But as time passed, she began to confront the uncomfortable truth: she had been wrong. One day, she wrote a letter addressed to Nia. In it, she apologized for her actions, acknowledging the pain she had caused and expressing a hope that Nia would continue to thrive despite the injustice she had endured. Whether Nia ever read the letter, Mrs. Whitewood didn't know, but for the first time, she felt a sliver of peace. By the end of the school year, Nia had become a symbol of resilience at East Haven. Her poetry was published in the school's literary magazine, and her leadership in the celebration of diversity inspired a wave of new initiatives. Students began to embrace their differences, and teachers took a more active role in fostering an inclusive environment. On the last day of school, Nia stood outside the building, watching as students spilled out into the bright summer sun. Her father joined her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Nia," he said. "You've turned something painful into something powerful." Nia looked up at him, her smile radiant. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they walked toward the car, Nia felt a sense of closure. She knew the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face. But for now, she felt ready. She had found her voice, and she wasn't afraid to use it. And in the quiet hum of the summer breeze, she knew she would never let anyone silence it again.